Steve Sarkisian is the best roster constructor in all of college football. And today, I'm going to tell you why. Sarkisian has built up Texas through elite recruiting. When you look at his recruiting classes at Texas, the 2022, 2023, 2024, and 2025 recruiting classes, they are ranked 5th, 3rd, 6th, and 1st. That's their rank. That is an average rank of just under 4th nationally. That is, I believe, just do some quick math here in my head. That is a 3.67 is their average rank over his past 4 classes. That's crazy. That right there is just genuinely crazy right there. The fact that his classes have been ranked that high in such a short time. And very quickly, his classes leveled up from what Texas had under Tom Herman. They're recruiting the line of scrimmage at an elite level, offensively and defensively. No one can pay more than Texas. No one can. They have the resources. They have the best athletic director in the country in Chris Del Conte, who continues to win the Director's Cup year over year over year. And Sark has learned from his previous coaching and coordinator endeavors and jobs. And while I still think game management is at times a question for Texas under Sark, and I think that they still have some ground to make up. I don't think they are where Sark wants them to be just quite yet, although they are oh so close. Maybe a year away, or maybe this is the year they arrive with Manning and all they return on defense, even though they also lose a lot to the draft. It's so impressive to see what Sark has built. I truly think he's the best roster constructor, and I will say that the reason I believe that is they don't have the weakness of Georgia, for example, where Georgia has just not been able to evaluate wide receivers. They haven't been able to develop them. And at quarterback, for example, they've had some ups and downs. I mean, you remember Stetson Bennett, of course, and Carson Beck in 23. But what about Carson Beck in 24? What about Bennett in 20? And what about Jake Fromm before him? What about them? I mean, the average Georgia quarterback has probably played under Smart at a similar level to the average quarterback under Sark. And Sark is well behind in tenure compared to Kirby. And Arch Manning is a better prospect than anyone who's come through Georgia's doors under Smart at quarterback. Maybe besides Justin Fields, who transferred out, went to Ohio State. You know the whole story. Speaking of Ohio State, when has Texas ever looked as bad as Ohio State has on the O-line in 23 and 24 at different times? Never, because they actually recruit the position, unlike Justin Fry, and their development isn't as spotty. They are better at playing as a cohesive unit on the O-line, Texas is, than almost anyone else in the country, even a top program like Ohio State in recent memory. And unlike Oregon, who's had to go to the portal to really reload in the O-line for last year and for 2025, Texas has just said, no thank you, we believe in our development, and we've proven it on the field. And then you look at Alabama. Alabama went 9-3 and had some pretty horrific QB play and a lot of questions on defense, despite inheriting a lot of good defensive talent. Sark every year has upgraded Texas's defense, practically, with this past season being his best by a mile at Texas, and actually per ESPN's FPI, it was the best defense in college football, which I think Ohio State's was better, but I also will agree that Ohio State's defense had some cornerbacks who were suspect and inconsistent, and Texas did not have a unit that was as inconsistent and weak at times as the Ohio State cornerback room. Great cornerback room. It's just Texas was near elite to elite at everything on defense. Ohio State was at every position outside of cornerback, where they were just great, which is still awesome. And all of that is not to insult Georgia or Oregon or Ohio State, maybe a little bit to Alabama, because the fact they didn't reach the playoff is just horrifically disappointing. But it's a compliment to Texas and how Steve Sarkisian has constructed his team and roster. And he's also developed at a high level, too. I mean, take a look at this. players drafted under Steve Sarkisian. No one was drafted in the 2022 draft after the 5-7 2021 campaign, which makes sense. There were improvements, there were bright spots that year, but a lot of double-digit blown leads because the culture was changing, the team was changing. It was a rough year one. In fact, that year, I will tell you, after that season, I kind of regrettably sold a lot of my stock in Steve Sarkisian. Although, following year, I predicted him to improve, and they did. And the year after that, I picked him to win the Big 12, which they did. Missed them reaching the playoffs, though. And then last year, I thought that they would lose 3 games. That was very incorrect of me, although I thought the schedule would be tougher than it was. 3 regular season games, not 3 games overall. Still thought they'd be top 10 in power ratings, though, and they were. So you look at first-round picks over the previous 3 NFL drafts where Texas players have been selected because they weren't selected in the first draft where Sark was the head coach. 6 first-rounders, an average of 2 per year. And then you look at 7 second and third rounders, and 15 fourth, 5th, 6th, and 7th rounders. That's a lot. That is quite a bit. That is just over 9 players drafted on average in all of Sark's years at Texas outside of his first year, which was a total. We're blowing everything up. We're hitting the fuse and the dynamite's gonna explode. We're rebuilding this thing from the ground up. I just cannot express enough how I think Sarkisian is right now the best roster constructor in all of football. Best head coach? I don't think so. I think that Smart is way better at game management. I think last year showed that even when Texas had the clearly better team. I think Day is better at game management. You saw that in the Cotton Bowl. You also saw that with how Texas and Ohio State both finished with 2 losses despite Ohio State playing the much tougher schedule. And then I think Lanning is a better game manager than Sark. And you saw that with how, look, Lanning beat 2 FPI top 10 teams last year. He won some close games. He punched above his weight class. He did not have the talent Texas did, and yet he won big games. And he beat the national champion. And Sark did not. And Sark's a year ahead of Lanning. He also inherited, to be fair, a much worse situation than Lanning did. But regardless, still a year ahead. Still has more talent to work with. Had a better team last year, still had 2 more losses with what I would argue was a similar schedule in the regular season, definitely an easier schedule. But regardless of that, that's game management. When I look at recruiting, when I look at development, when I look at piecing a roster together and piecing it together properly, which means you're recruiting everywhere and not neglecting a certain position, Sark's number 1. I mean, what position have they neglected? What have they neglected? I can't name one. I can name one for Georgia, wide receivers, maybe even QB, depending on how Stockton pans out this year. I can name one for Ohio State, O-line. Even though they're fixing that right now with Bowen, they've neglected it as recently as January of 2025. And then, I mean, with how Larry Johnson's been recruiting recently on the D-line, they might be neglecting that as well. And then you look at Oregon. Oregon has had some, honestly, I was shocked their blue chip ratio on the O-line was only 50%. That shocked me. And I don't know if their wide receivers have exactly panned out in previous classes. And their secondary classes certainly didn't. That's why they had to have all those transfers last year. So Sark is the best of the best when it comes to constructing a roster. He's the best roster builder. And every season at Texas, under Sark, the Longhorns have improved. I don't know if that will quite be the case this year, because at some point you get to a point as a team and a program where you're kind of trying to tread water and occasionally go up, but you'll have some years where you have to regress just because it's hard to feel the go. It's hard to improve every year when you eventually become a top 5 team and even top 3, top 2 team. And Texas is approaching that very quickly. But I would be inclined to say they're at least going to tread water and be a similar team to what they were last year. And who knows? Maybe they can be better. And I'm not saying that. I'm not saying that with Oregon. I'm not saying that with Ohio State. I'm not saying it with Notre Dame, certainly not. Alabama may, but Alabama also was not a top 5 team last year. And I might say it with Georgia because Georgia wasn't top 5 last year either, and a lot went wrong for them. But Texas, out of all the teams that many would consider top 4, top 5 in power ratings, that's the only one I think is going to stay the same or get better, at least from the FPI power ratings. I think that Oregon and Ohio State and some considered Ole Miss top 4 in power ratings, and Notre Dame for sure, those teams have some things to work with and some issues with all they lost and what they bring back. I don't think Texas quite has that. And then as for Penn State, well, they return more than all those teams, including Texas. So that's a different conversation, a different team, a different video. But Sarkisian, I think, clearly is the best roster builder in college football. Heck, I would say last year showed that. I mean, think of how many games that they almost tried to lose and couldn't because they were that talented. And then think about how they played Ohio State, how Ohio State was on fire against Oregon and Tennessee, and for 2.5 quarters against Notre Dame, and then was never consistent and only put together 2 consistent drives against Texas. Think about that. And that Ohio State team was insane in the postseason. Just don't kid yourself. Don't try and put on a different pair of glasses with a shade that is biased against Texas. I know that Texas has had a lot of moments where they say, "Oh, well, we're going to be back soon," and then they try to kick down the door and they, completely snap and hyperextend their leg. That's not what's happening here. Texas is back. Texas won the Big 12 their final year in the conference. They've made the playoff 2 years in a row. They competed with Ohio State, brought them down to the wire. They competed with Georgia in the SEC championship game, brought them down to the wire. And those are the top 2 programs in America right now. And they just signed the number 1 recruiting class and put a school record number of NFL players into the draft. So that's all I have to say here. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell. Do those things. I very much appreciate it.